Hello everyone, Mary Ann, your trusty art historian here, and I want to welcome you back to my series on the Great Gatsby. I encourage you to watch all the videos in the series because information from earlier presentations may carry over and help you enjoy later ones. This series will be of benefit to teachers who want some new perspectives on the novel, to students who might have a paper to write and want some unique new information, and to the general public who might be interested in the background and meaning of the novel so they can enjoy it in a deeper way. So welcome aboard everyone. Please note that I always use Scribner's paperback edition with notes and preface by Matthew J. Broccoli from 1995 in my references. Today we're going to see that in The Great Gatsby, it is the characters who drive the narrative forward. It's not large historical events or forces. The characters are shaped by their time, their upbringing, their life experiences, and interior motives, and they create the major events that happen in the novel. Character is king in The Great Gatsby. We will only examine the characters of Nick Carraway, Tom and Daisy Buchanan, and Jay Gatsby today, along with his cohort, Meyer Wolfsheim. We'll look at Tom and Myrtle Wilson and Jordan Baker in the later sessions. So enjoy everyone, and don't forget to like this video, make any comments you wish, and if you want to make sure you get notified each time I post a new video, subscribe to my channel. So let's get started with session 2 in our series and explore the major characters in The Great Gatsby. Now we know that many of the characters in the novel had some autobiographical connection to F.Scott Fitzgerald himself. These would be people he knew, people he had read about, people he wished he could be more like, as well as actual characteristics of Scott Fitzgerald himself. Now Fitzgerald actually told us how he created his characters, and I've written that up on the screen. He said, "Begin with an individual, and before you know it, you will find you have created a type. Begin with a type, and you will find that you have created nothing." That is because we are all queer fish, queerer behind our faces and voices than we want anyone to know or than we know ourselves. So all of his characters are compelled to act due to what they are out of their own inner compulsions. Exterior circumstances don't push the narrative, the characters do. And while the novel is informed by the 1920s, it's the characters who drive the narrative. They are not rustled about here and there because of wars, revolutions, and so forth, but the series of events that take place over one summer, to be exact, are pushed forward by the characters themselves. Their backgrounds, their ideas, their insecurities, their obsessions, their strengths, and their weaknesses. So in one sense, this is a novel about people, and we're going to focus on that today. But keep in mind the novel is also about so much more than that as well. As we move through the series, we will see that it is about America and all the contradictions, promises, broken promises, and richness of our nation and culture. Now, as I talk about the characters, I'm not going to be showing you images of Tobey Maguire or Sam Waterston or Robert Redford or Mia Farrow. Rather, I'm going to show you images done by major magazine illustrators from the 1920s. Remember that F.Scott Fitzgerald wrote for popular magazines such as the Saturday Evening Post, and he was immersed in this new world of mass communication and the images it produced for a large swath of the population. And Fitzgerald refers to the world of tabloid magazines throughout the novel. Myrtle Wilson reads them, Jordan Baker appears on the cover of one of them, so they are very much a part of the backdrop of The Great Gatsby. Now this illustration that we see here could be a young Nick Carraway, getting fitted for his Army uniform. And this is from the magazine illustrator J.C. Leyendecker. And remember that both Nick and Gatsby were in World War I. So let's talk about Nick. What we know about Nick is what Nick tells us. He's the narrator. And so, with some exceptions, the novel is completely told through his eyes. He is the one who judges everyone else around him. We learn a few things from Jordan and Daisy, but mostly we hear from Nick. So he is a key figure in the novel, and in many ways, as we shall see, he had many characteristics that F. Scott Fitzgerald had, such as he comes from the Midwest. He goes to West Egg and is a keen observer of those around him. And we know that Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda lived on Long Island in 1922 and 1923, and it was indeed there, while they were living on Long Island, where The Great Gatsby is set, that Fitzgerald conceived of the novel. Now, Nick is the only to the manor born among the Westeggers. He seems to be an open guy. He's generous of spirit to an extent. He avoids talk of money. He shuns conspicuous consumption, and is really, in the end, the only major character that stays true to Gatsby. Remember, it is Nick who stays with Gatsby to the bitter end and ultimately buries him. But let's start at the beginning. Nick, the narrator, gives us his background very early in the novel. Indeed, on page 7, chapter 1, we get his description. And let's just go through this and read it together. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western cities for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I graduated from New Haven, by this he means Yale University, in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn the bond business. I just want to point out again that everything that is in bold here, those are my bolds to point specific things out and bring emphasis to them. They are not in the original novel. So from this, these words, we learn that Nick is from the Midwest. We know that he comes from a prominent family. We know that he served in World War I, but we also know that his grandfather's brother, who arrived in America in 1851, was able to send a substitute to the Civil War. So this is indicative of Nick's privilege. And to further this idea that he comes from privilege, comes from some important background, he tells us that there is a quote-unquote tradition that they descended from a line of Scottish royalty, the Buccleuchs. Now, Wikipedia tells us the following about the Dukes of Buccleuch. Quote, the substantial origin of the ducal house of the Scots of Buccleuch dates back to the large grants of lands in Scotland to Sir Walter Scott of Kirkcudbright and Buccleuch, a border chief by James II, in consequence of the fall of the 8th Earl of Douglas in 1452. But the family traced their descent back to Sir Richard le Scott, who lived from 1249 to 1285. Now this is important because, again, Nick is tracing his ancestors back to Sir Richard le Scott. And this reference then, of course, because it's Sir Richard le Scott, refers back to F.Scott Fitzgerald himself. These are the small clues that we must explore as we move through the text. So once again, this is one of Nick's connection back to Scott's own autobiography. And Nick also graduates from New Haven, i.e. Yale University, in 1915. And we learn that his father also went to Yale. So there's this history of Ivy League education and privilege that permeates Nick's background. But after the war, we read that Nick gets restless and he moves from Middle West to the East, and he becomes a bond salesman, like so many others in the boom economy and the post-war generation. So these are important clues about who Nick is and how he's going to look at the rest of the characters in the novel, since remember, he's the one that we learn pretty much everything from. About Gatsby, about Daisy, about Tom, about Jordan. It's pretty much through Nick's eyes that we see the novel. So when we're talking about Nick, I always think of these magazine illustrations and advertisements that were produced by people such as J.C. Leyendecker in the teens and 20s. And so here we have a couple of images by J.C. Leyendecker of Nick as a young stockbroker, perhaps. And again, we know that Leyendecker did illustrations for Arrow collar, Kuppenheimer suits, and also interwoven socks. And this is an interwoven socks illustration from 1921 on the right. And remember, the novel takes place over the summer of 1922. The piece on the left is Man with Cane and Gloves from 1914, so it's earlier. But again, these are the types of images and personal presentation that F. Scott Fitzgerald might have been influenced by as he describes his characters. They were sort of the epitome of the American idea of itself as seen through magazines, tabloid articles, and so forth in the 19-teens and 20s. And so these could be images of the young Nick Carraway as he goes to work in the morning, or as he hangs out in his cottage at Gatsby's estate reading books about the bond trade. These are the kinds of ways that we really can look at how F. Scott Fitzgerald is presenting his characters. Now here we have a detail of that J.C. Leyendecker illustration we saw earlier in the video of a young soldier getting fitted for his uniform in a very kind of swanky conservative store. And here on the right we actually have F. Scott Fitzgerald in his Army uniform, which we know he purchased from Brooks Brothers around 1918. And one of the things that scholars talk about in regards to Nick as a character is to what extent Nick is in some ways F. Scott Fitzgerald himself. And in many ways, of course, he is. Both Nick and F. Scott Fitzgerald grew up in the Midwest and came from merchant families. Nick's family sold hardware. Scott's family was in the grocery business. David S. Brown, in his recent book, Paradise Lost, A Life of F. Scott Fitzgerald, notes that Fitzgerald was a Midwestern moralist, even a prude, with, quote, ultra-conventional views on sex, marriage, and child-rearing, unquote. So F. Scott Fitzgerald grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. He moves east to attend an Ivy League school, Princeton in his case, in the same way Nick grew up in the Midwest and moved east to attend Yale University in New Haven. So Fitzgerald, like Nick, enters the Army as well. But unlike Nick and Gatsby, Fitzgerald never actually sees combat, much to his dismay. And so when we compare the illustration by J.C. Leyendecker and this photograph of Fitzgerald in his uniform, and again, I just reiterate, he goes to Brooks Brothers to buy his uniform. These are all influenced. Scott's decisions and his decision to position himself in profile in this way, in the very same way that Leyendecker positions his model in this profile. It's a very specific influence that's happening through these mass media images. And it's really the mass media that informs a great deal of the novel. And during the early 1920s, the age of mass media is just beginning. And in later sessions of this series, we're going to see the extent to which mass production and mass media are major factors in the novel. But it really does begin here with how Scott chooses to portray his major characters. And so there are many points in the novel where we can reasonably assume that Nick's ideas, values, even prejudices reflect those of F. Scott Fitzgerald to some extent. So that said, let's move on to another major character in the novel, Tom Buchanan, and see how that plays out. Here we have two more J.C. Leyendecker magazine illustrations, one from 1916 showing a football player, and one from 1914 that help us picture Tom Buchanan in our eyes through the imagery of the period. So on the left, we know about Tom Buchanan that he played football at Yale, which is where Nick knew him. Nick had already met Tom and knew him at Yale and knew that Tom was a big football player. And now we know that on the right, Tom plays polo and he hangs out with his rich friends. And here we have, for the House of Kuppenheimer, Chicago, an ad illustrated by J.C. Leyendecker of a polo game. So this is how we can reasonably imagine Scott Fitzgerald visually saw these two characters. Now in chapter 1, after Nick gives us Tom Buchanan's background, we are immediately drawn into a dinner party that Daisy and Tom give for Nick. And remember, Nick is Daisy's a distant cousin. And at the party is also another woman named Jordan Baker, who is a friend of Tom and Daisy's, and she happens to be a professional golfer. And in this chapter, Nick tells us that Tom is from Chicago, and now he apparently does nothing but play polo and read books of dubious worth, according to Nick. So like Nick, Tom is from the Midwest and has moved east, just like Fitzgerald was originally from the Midwest and moved east. Now, I'm going to explore this movement from the Midwest to the East later in the series, but it's essential to see Tom and Nick against that geographical background as well. So always keep that in the back of your head. And we also know from Chapter 1 that F.Scott Fitzgerald does not depict Tom in a positive way whatsoever. We learn that Tom cheated on Daisy on their honeymoon in California, and he is now cheating on her with Mabel. He is an immoral man. He does what he wishes. He has the money to cover up his mistakes. And physically, as we see this particularly in the J.C. Leyendecker image on the left, Nick describes Tom as having a quote, body of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So let's now look more precisely at the text and at Nick's description of Tom through a close reading of that text. Here we go. We're going to look at page 10 and 11 from Chapter 1, where we have Nick's description of Tom at this dinner party. Let's take the first quote first. Daisy's husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that had ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of an anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. Again, I emphasize that the bold text is my emphasis, not Fitzgerald's. But he describes Tom as physically powerful, enormously wealthy, acute limited excellence at 21. In other words, his life at 30, he's already on the downward flow of life away from college. So he had this acute but limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of an anticlimax. So this is not a positive description. And then further, on page 11 of the same chapter, he had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So Tom is described physically and mentally here. He is powerful, wealthy beyond belief, had a hard mouth, an arrogant manner, supercilious means arrogant, and cruelty is hinted at in his physical manner. And then if we go forward onto page 16, we read that he has bruised Daisy's little finger, and she calls him a brute of a man, hulking. This is how his own wife describes him. And even though she says to him, oh, you know, you hurt my little finger, you bruised my little finger, you didn't mean to, but somehow in the back of one's mind, one's going, really? How has he hurt her little finger? And then have her describe him as hulking. So this is how Daisy describes her own husband. So from the beginning, Tom is a negative, brutal presence in the novel. And he could easily be that football player in the Leyendecker illustration. And again, we know that he's cheating on Mabel. He's cheating on Daisy. He's really sort of an immoral man and has this body of enormous leverage, this cruel body. And we have to see him in this light. But now let's continue on and see who in F.Scott Fitzgerald's mind and in F.Scott Fitzgerald's life might have inspired the figure of Tom Buchanan. Are two images of a gentleman named Tommy Hitchcock, And Tommy Hitchcock, we see him here playing polo on the left and as a World War I war hero on the right. Fitzgerald himself hinted in several statements that Tom Buchanan might have been inspired by a Long Island socialite and polo player named Tommy Hitchcock, shown above. Now, Hitchcock was known to brutally play the game of polo, even to the extent of injuring the horses he rode. Hitchcock was afraid of nothing. He grew up rich, he went to Harvard, he was a war hero. He married a Mellon, a family with fabulous amounts of old money. And F.Scott Fitzgerald was very aware of Tommy Hitchcock's reputation, money, and war exploits. For we know that Tommy Hitchcock was a war hero. He was in World War I, and during his 3 months at the French front, Hitchcock was credited with 2 quote-unquote kills, German planes shot down. Then, of course, he himself was shot down behind enemy lines. And you would think that then, okay, he's going to go into a prisoner of war camp or whatever. But no, he was wounded, and he indeed was captured and held by the Germans for 6 months. But what did he do? He escaped by jumping from a train that was transporting prisoners from one facility to another. So he jumps out of a moving train, and after 8 days of hunger and cold, hiding by day and traveling by night, he reached the safety of the Swiss border 100 miles away. So he really was a man of enormous power, physical strength, emotional strength. He was indeed the war hero that F.Scott Fitzgerald had always wished to be, was not given the opportunity to become that. And we know from letters that F.Scott Fitzgerald really admired Tommy Hitchcock and probably wished he could have been more like him. But F.Scott Fitzgerald does not just slavishly mirror the real Tommy Hitchcock with Tom Buchanan. There's not a one-on-one correspondence. Because for one thing, Tom Buchanan was not a war hero. There is no indication that he served in the war whatsoever in the novel. So while there are some superficial similarities, the wealth, the polo playing, Hitchcock had this lavish Long Island estate just like Tom Buchanan did, and he had a wealthy wife just like Tom Buchanan did. Though that's where the similarities between these two characters end. But we do know that Fitzgerald was thinking about Tommy Hitchcock as he conceived of the character of Tom Buchanan. And so with that, let's move on to Daisy. So let's take a look at Daisy Buchanan. She, of course, is one of the major characters in the novel, and she is, of course, Tom's wife and Gatsby's lover. Here I show you an image on the left by J.C. Leyendecker brother, who was also an illustrator. His name was Frank Leyendecker, and he became a successful illustrator as well. Now remember that Frank and J.C. Leyendecker were German immigrants. And yet they were able to vividly capture the mood and look of early 20th century America in a way that few others were able to. Until Norman Rockwell came along, it was the Leyendecker brothers who told America what America looked like. So this is the positive side of immigration. And you'll recall that during this time period, Germany was not exactly favored by Americans. And yet here come these two German immigrants in the early 20th century and really show us who we are in a way. In this illustration, we see a woman very much along the lines of Daisy Buchanan. We recall that Daisy Buchanan was a Southerner. She hailed from Louisville, Kentucky. And Zelda, Scott's wife, was also a Southerner who came from Montgomery, Alabama. Now, Louisville is sort of a one step up on the rung from Montgomery. It was a little bit larger and more sophisticated city at the time. And Fitzgerald, like Gatsby, was even briefly stationed in Louisville at Camp Taylor, southeast of the city in 1918 during World War I. So he actually had ties to the city that he had Daisy being from. And one of the first things that Nick tells us about his cousin is that she is superficial and insincere, pampered, abused, and pretty much without a purpose in life. And here we see, illustrated by Frank Leyendecker, sort of that kind of person, obsessed with her hosiery, sitting in her luxurious surroundings, with her gossamer clothing on, in her pampered lifestyle. And this could easily be a portrait of Daisy Buchanan herself, coming right out, again, of the tabloids. Now let's look at a close reading of some of the text about Daisy. On page 21, chapter 1, we have a conversation between Nick and Daisy. And this is what Daisy says. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding." Nick: "I wasn't back from the war." Daisy: "That's true," she hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything." Nick says to himself, evidently she had reason to be. Just a reminder, everything in bold is my emphasis. So here Daisy shows us how shallow she is. She fusses at Nick for not having attended her wedding, but recall that Nick was fighting in the war. He was in France being shot at, living in a trench, whatever was happening to Nick and Gatsby during the World War I. "I wasn't back from the war." Oh, that's very true. But then she turns it right back on herself. "Well, I've had a very bad time." So she has to come back with how bad a time she's had and completely oversteps Nick's comment about how he couldn't attend her wedding because he wasn't back from the war. I find this very telling. And Nick agrees, probably because he is seeing firsthand what goes on in the Buchanan household. Evidently, she had reason to be. He's seen a couple of interactions by this point with Daisy and Tom, and he's kind of becoming knowledgeable about what's going on in the Buchanan household, and it's not really very positive. So early on, in this first chapter, Nick has seen that Tom is a brute and possibly violent, and that Daisy is self-centered and cynical. It's all right here, as clear as day. Now let's continue to read, but I want to note that in the lower left corner I have another J.C. Leyendecker illustration called Kissing Cupid from 1923. This, of course, could be Daisy as well, and I show it because yesterday was Easter, and this was an illustration for an Easter edition. But you can see this woman absorbed in herself and sort of an unrealistic romantic dream with Cupid in this cage. But let's read carefully here on page 22 of chapter 21. "The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me feel uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged." In this quote, Nick gets irritated with Daisy and Tom and their world, and refers to the fact that she and Tom are part of a quote-unquote secret society. Despite the negatives in their relationship, they belong to the same secret society in the same club. So even though they might be at odds with one another, and even though Tom might be physically abusing her in some minor way or major way, emotionally, physically, in whatever sense you wish, they still belong to the same club. This is important because in the end you'll see that they continue always to be true to that secret society, that same club. And Nick also feels that they're using him, just like they end up using everyone else. Nick begins to feel manipulated, and he begins to doubt that the idealized life that Tom and Daisy are living is a positive one, is one that has value. He sees that it's an act, a facade, and a life that is really only open to a select few to observe and possibly envy. But certainly in the end, everyone who is not part of the secret society or club really becomes its victim, as we will see. So again, these words that she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. It's a sense of exclusion, even to the exclusion of her cousin Nick, who roughly belongs in the same social echelons as she does. He is, after all, her cousin, but he clearly is not at the same socioeconomic level that she and Tom belong to, and thus even Nick begins to feel excluded. Now let's look at the relationship between Daisy and the women in F.Scott Fitzgerald life to see who and what inspired Daisy and her narrative in the novel. Now, it would appear that Daisy is a conflation between Fitzgerald's lost love, Chicago socialite Ginevra King, who you see here on the right. And Scott first met Ginevra King on January 4th, 1915, while visiting Marie Hersey, her roommate from Westover in St. Paul, Minnesota. They met at a sledding party, and according to letters and diary entries, they both immediately became infatuated. They sent letters back and forth for months, and their romance continued until January of 1917. According to Fitzgerald biographer Andrew Meisner, Fitzgerald, quote, remained devoted to Ginevra as long as she would allow him to, unquote, and she became his inspiration for various characters in his novels, including Daisy Buchanan. But ultimately, Fitzgerald received a chilly reception from Mr. and Mrs. King when he was found to be wanting of a trust fund. Ginevra ended the romance shortly thereafter. She later married Billy Mitchell, a socially prominent World War I flying ace, very much like Tommy Hitchcock. Mr. King, Ginevra's father, reportedly told F. Scott Fitzgerald, quote, poor boys don't marry rich girls. And then on the left, we see a photograph of Zelda Fitzgerald, whom Scott ultimately did marry. But in many ways, the romance with Zelda and Scott mirrors the romance between Daisy Buchanan and Gatsby. Scott meets his future wife Zelda while at Camp Sheridan outside Montgomery, Alabama in July of 1918. But you can see from this letter that he writes to Ginevra in that same month that he was still corresponding with her. You see the date right here? July 1st, this is probably, 1918. And so he's still corresponding with her, but then he begins courting his future wife, Zelda. And he never forgot about Ginevra King. He never forgot about this first love. And he really continued to mine this failed romance in his novel and stories for years to come. But returning to Zelda, even Zelda also was a problem for Scott. He couldn't marry Ginevra because he was poor and she was rich. And he ends up in somewhat of the same situation with Zelda. She came from a prominent Montgomery, Alabama family, and they wanted her to marry well. They wanted her to marry someone rich who could take care of her, since in those days, particularly in the South, there was no independent way for a woman to support herself outside the making of a good marriage. Scott did not have a penny. They fell in love, they were engaged. Zelda breaks off the engagement when she realized that Scott did not have the means to support her or her lifestyle. And that in turn prompted, forced Scott to pen his first novel, This Side of Paradise. This Side of Paradise was completed by September 1920, and when Scott heard the novel had been accepted by Scribner's, he wrote to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, urging an accelerated release. Quote, I have so many things depending on its success, including, of course, a girl. And that girl, of course, was Zelda. The book was published on March 26, 1921. Scott married Zelda on April 3rd. Scott got his girl. But what about Gatsby? Did Gatsby get his girl? Did he get the girl he met in Louisville during the war? No. Unlike Zelda and Scott, Daisy and Gatsby are not successfully reunited, and Daisy marries the wealthy Tom Buchanan. This is what sets off all the action in the novel, because Gatsby and Daisy did not have the good fortune of Scott and Zelda. They were more along the lines of Scott and Ginevra King. Ginevra King goes on to marry a wealthy man, just like Daisy goes on to marry a wealthy Tom Buchanan. Here we have two J.C. Leyendecker images for our Great Gatsby character. The one on the left shows a Harvard man rowing, or as F.Scott Fitzgerald calls it, beating. Gatsby was definitely not a Harvard man, quite the opposite, but F.Scott Fitzgerald continually throughout the novel makes reference to rowing or beating, probably as a metaphor for striving and seeking, which is what Gatsby does in order to attain Daisy. Now on the right we see an image of a gentleman in a pink striped suit, very stylish, but remember it is Gatsby's pink suit that is a tell for Tom that Gatsby is not worthy of Daisy and that he is not of the same social class as Tom and Daisy. In Chapter 7, page 129, Tom says that Gatsby couldn't possibly have gone to Oxford. And what is the reason? Well, he tells Jordan Baker, quote, "An Oxford man, like hell he is. He wears a pink suit," unquote. So here we have clothing as a marker of class. F. Scott Fitzgerald gives us countless clues in the novel about various occupations, hobbies, possessions, and speech patterns that declare social class and boundaries. Now here we have the two J.C. Leyendecker slides again, one in which we've been using to describe Tom Buchanan on the left as a football player at Harvard, and then on the right, Gatsby wearing his pink suit from 1930. But on November 20th, 1924, after reading the novel for the first time, but before final edits were made, F. Scott Fitzgerald's editor at Scribner's, Max Perkins, writes to Scott, quote, "Gatsby is somewhat vague. The reader's eyes can never quite focus upon him. His outlines are dim. Couldn't he be physically described as distinctly as the others? And couldn't you add one or two characteristics like the use of the phrase old sport? Not verbal, but physical ones, perhaps." Then Scott writes back to Max Perkins, and this is an astonishing quote. This is worth the price of this lecture, of this session. This is what Scott replies to Max Perkins. First, he says that he himself does not know what Gatsby looked like or was engaged in. And then he says this, and it's truly astounding. Quote, "After careful searching of the files of a man's mind," here, meaning of Scott's mind, "for the Fuller McGee case, and after having Zelda draw pictures until her fingers ache, I know Gatsby better than my own child." Then listen to this. Quote, "My first instinct after your letter was to let him, i.e. Gatsby, go and have Tom Buchanan dominate the book. I suppose he's the best character I've ever done. But Gatsby sticks in my heart. I had him for a while, then lost him, and now I know him again." So this is astonishing. He gets a letter from his editor, Max Perkins, saying, "Couldn't you do a little bit better job of describing J. Gatsby?" And Scott's answer was, "Well, you know, really, Tom Buchanan is the best character I've ever done, and I actually thought about just letting Gatsby go and focusing on Tom. But oh gee, Gatsby sticks in my heart. And I had him for a while, then I lost him, and now I have him again. So I'm going to incorporate him back as a major character in the novel." So that's an astonishing revelation and something to think about as we read and reread the novel. How would the novel have changed if F. Scott Fitzgerald had quote unquote let Gatsby go and let Tom Buchanan dominate the book? Do you think Tom Buchanan's a better character than Gatsby? And if so, why? These are some of the things to think about as you read the novel. But for now, we know that F. Scott Fitzgerald was thinking of, as he said, the Fuller McGee case as he tried to reimagine Gatsby. So what was the Fuller McGee case? Well, it involved a gangster that I show you here named Arnold Rothstein. And here he is in front of a very interesting microphone or telephone or some such thing, perhaps at one of the trials that he had, because he was a gangster. So the Fuller McGee case centers around E.M. Fuller, who was a brokerage company, selling stocks and bonds that filed for bankruptcy. But when the feds went to seize the assets of this brokerage company, all the assets were gone. All the money was missing. So the feds went to court, and upon examining evidence, they saw that a large number of checks and assets had been given over to a gangster named Arnold Rothstein. And according to the crime writer Leo Kachner, Rothstein, quote, transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business run like a corporation with himself at the top, unquote. Rothstein was the person who first realized that prohibition was a business opportunity, a means to enormous wealth, who, quote, understood the truths of early century capitalism, giving people what they want, and came to dominate them, unquote. So his notoriety, Arnold Rothstein's notoriety, inspired several fictional characters based on his life, and he was portrayed in contemporary and later short stories, novels, musicals, and films. His life has inspired many a movie. So Gatsby lived in an Arnold Rothstein world of gangsters and bootleggers. And who was Gatsby's mentor and business associate? Well, it was a fellow by the name of Meyer Wolfsheim, and he and Gatsby are colleagues. And it was actually Arnold Rothstein who fixed the 1919 World Series. And in Chapter 4, page 78, when Nick meets Wolfsheim with Gatsby in New York, Nick asks Gatsby, what is the deal with Wolfsheim? And Gatsby answers, quote, he's the man who fixed the World Series in 1919, unquote. So in fact, it was Rothstein who did that. So again, we have the conflation of a fictional Wolfsheim with the very real gangster of Arnold Rothstein. So Fitzgerald very effectively uses real people and real events and incorporates the two into the novel to create his character. He did that with Tommy Hitchcock. He did that with Daisy Buchanan and Ginevra King and Zelda Fitzgerald. All of these things, it's a big mush of interwoven characters and themes. But there is something else about Gatsby that's important to point out. And Fitzgerald presents Gatsby in a very unique way. And I want to look at that in the next few slides and pay close attention, because we are going to continue with this kind of description of Gatsby that we're going to talk about right now. In these two images, we see that once again, the importance of the new tabloid media to the novel. We have a Success magazine from January 1920, and then we have a Real Life Stories tabloid, which dominated magazine stands in the 1920s. So mass advertising and popular magazines in the 1920s were a relatively new thing. They were the direct result of mass production made possible by the new industrialization, and also by new forms of mass media, namely widely distributed newspapers and magazines, and of course, the radio. The Real Life magazine from the 1920s, again, we have frank revelation of love, adventure, romance, putting forth the possibilities of life. But they are magazines, they're not real life, and F.Scott Fitzgerald understood that. So in Chapter 3, page 70 and 71, Gatsby is driving Nick to Manhattan, and he begins to tell Nick about himself. He's really anxious to have Nick approve of him. And so he tells Nick he was born rich, he lived like a young Raja in the cities of Europe, collecting rubies and hunting big game, paintings, etc. It was a very tall tale, and Nick suspects that Gatsby was pulling his leg. And in the end, Nick seems to doubt everything Gatsby is telling him. He recognizes that the life Gatsby is talking to him about is like a tall tale from a tabloid magazine. And Gatsby is a sort of a put-together character, and Nick really does doubt his sincerity. So Nick seems to ask, is this guy for real? And in the end, on page 71, Nick says, quote, my incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming through a dozen magazines. Gatsby was not real. He had invented himself out of tabloid magazines and movies, or invented himself in the same way that a magazine or a movie sort of puts together these scenes and these scenarios to appeal to a wider public. So Fitzgerald is really calling into question the values seen in magazines, such as the new success. He's not really celebrating it. And finally, before ending the session, I want to point out just one other very important aspect of F.Scott Fitzgerald's description of Gatsby. And again, this will also be critical as we go forward. We don't get a glimpse of Gatsby until page 25 at the very end of Chapter 1. And Nick does not meet Gatsby, he just sees him. And he sees him in a very distinct way. He doesn't see him giving instructions to servants or taking a sunbath in the pool. No, Fitzgerald chooses to depict this first scene with Gatsby in it very, very specifically. He shows him alone. He's looking at the stars. He's looking to see what share was his of the local heavens. Let's read together. Page 25, chapter 1. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share of his of our local heavens. So he's presenting Gatsby as a mysterious figure, a romantic figure. He does not describe his physical traits. He shows him immersed in nature, the silver pepper of the stars. This is a very specific way of looking at Gatsby, alone in nature, contemplating his dream. And this is our very first look at Gatsby, and this is what Fitzgerald gives us. He gives us this romantic image. And this will become very important later as we discuss how F.Scott Fitzgerald positions Gatsby as the leading man of the novel. This is our final slide today. I'm sure you're tired and wanting to go do something else, but let's finish with this because it just reinforces what I just said. F.Scott Fitzgerald continues to talk about this image of Gatsby alone as a single figure in chapter 1. So let's just read from page 25. But I didn't call to him. So Nick sees him up there on his lawn looking out at this green light. But Nick doesn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. So again, he vanishes into the darkness. He's alone. He's reaching towards this green light. He's intimating at what Gatsby might be seeking. And again, it's just this romantic notion of Gatsby himself. And keep this in mind as we explore further. We're going to elaborate upon this romantic Gatsby notion and see where it really comes from in American art and literature. So this is the end of our discussion today. I want to thank you for staying with me through the entire video. I want to encourage you to join me for future videos on The Great Gatsby. Please like this video if you did, and subscribe to my channel to see more. See you next time when we're going to talk about Gatsby's places.